normal tutuyorum. So I'm starting if everyone is okay. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us here today at our side event, assessment of the updated NDCs from G20 countries by civil society, and also thanks to WWF for granting us this space at the Panda Pavilion. My name is Cansu. I am Can Europe's Climate and Energy Policies Officer for Turkey, and our speakers today are Luisa Lima, Political Advisor for Greenpeace Brazil, Oliver Tuhi, Manager of the International Climate Program of WWF Australia, and Tanyeli Behit Sabuncu, Climate and Energy Practice Manager of WWF Turkey. Thank you all for being here today. So, as you know, last year we have closed COP26 with the Glasgow decision, and the decision called the parties of the Paris Agreement to submit more ambitious NDCs to be in line with 1.5-degree goal before the COP27. And some of the parties, most of the parties have submitted updated NDCs, and some pledged to do so soon. But still, even with the updated NDCs, we have a big gap ambition and emission between us and the 1.5 threshold. So just before COP27, we have received two important reports, the NDC synthesis report and the emission gap report. And I want to quote from ECHO here, the civil society's newsletter and our precious. ECHO said on its opening issue, screaming with capital letters, that we are not on track. We are not on track for 1.5. And as the reports show, the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 is shrinking. And the policies in place at the moment are putting us on a track that goes to 2.8 degrees of global temperature rise by the end of this century. And if the updated NDCs, all of them, conditional and unconditional ones, are implemented properly, we are still on track for a 2.4 degrees of global temperature rise. So as the world population, we are being subjected to the catastrophic effects of the climate change more and more every day, but some of us are, of course, affected more by it, as we recently have been reminded by the floods in Pakistan. So as the emission gap report this year reminded us again, what we need is urgent and system-wide transformation. And today, G20 countries are collectively responsible of 75% of global greenhouse emission gases. So it is urgent, as civil society always says at COPs, for G20 countries to update their NDCs with way more ambitious one and implement those NDCs strictly. So today we will discuss the NDCs of three G20 countries, Australia, Brazil, and Turkey. Australia and Brazil recently updated their NDCs, and Turkey has pledged to update its NDC during COP27. So with our speakers today, we will discuss the scope of and emission of these countries' NDCs. And then we will continue with discussing the sectoral focuses for emissions. And we will also discuss how participatory was the NDC development processes for these countries. So I want to start with Luisa. Luisa, last year, the Glasgow climate decision called the parties of the Paris Agreement to submit more ambitious NDCs, and has it been the case with Brazil? Can you give us an overview of the Brazil's NDC, and does it meet the demands of the civil society?
Hi everyone, thanks for the invitation to Tanyeli, to WWF to be here. Well, answering very straight to your question, it's no, for a reason that only being Brazilian and living in Bolsonaro's government, it's believable, but no, our NDC becomes less ambitious than it first presented during its revisions. So explaining briefly and trying to be clear, our first NDC, Brazilian NDC, was presented back in 2016 and had some absolute targets of emission reduction targets, which were to reduce 37% of our emissions in 2025 and indicative contributions of reductions of 43% in 2030 all of them based on 2005 emissions levels. In 2020, this first NDC, of course, us from civil society, Greenpeace, we wanted it to be more ambitious because we could have had more ambitious targets at that moment, but it was an NDC that was accepted internationally. It demonstrated some eager to contribute to the negotiations and to the climate changes. But then, already in Bolsonaro's government, we have passed through 2 other revisions. The first one was in 2020, and it was really crazy because it didn't increase our targets, so we kept with the same numbers, 37% by 2025, 43% in 2030. What did they change was, and all of them based on 2005 emissions. So same numbers, same targets, but what they did was changing the methodology used to calculate how was our emissions levels in 2005. That's fine. An updated methodology, it's welcomed. If we have improved our capability to calculate our emissions, also great. But then, during this revision of the emissions from 2005, actually, they realized that we had emitted more than previously achieved. So from 2.1 gigatons, we had actually emitted 3.8 gigatons. But when you keep the same targets being like, if you have emitted more, it means that to achieve your target, then you can emit more carbon emissions, not less, as it was supposed to have, in a clear violation to the principle of progression of the Paris Agreement. This was widely denounced in Brazil. It was known over there as, if someone speaks Portuguese and it's Brazilian, it's pedalada climática. It's kind of a carbon trick maneuver. And then this year, in March of 2022, they submitted a second update of the NDC, in which they, yes, increased a little bit of our ambitions in terms going from 43% in 2030 to 50%, but it still doesn't correct this maneuver that happened. We still have an NDC that is less ambitious than the first one presented. So civil society is urgently claiming to the new government now that we are eager that we can say that, update its NDC, combining the best science available with really strengthening mitigation targets that are aligned with 1.5 trajectory, including specific targets for sectors. We have like just some broad sectors at this point, with as well less ambitious than it was supposed to have, for instance, with deforestation. Now we have a target that's completely unacceptable, that it's to end illegal deforestation by 2028. So our demand is that we have to have zero deforestation, not only illegal deforestation, by 2030, and I can come back to that a little bit later. We need also an NDC that's not only more ambitious in terms of mitigation, but also that considers properly adaptation. So we need to ensure an effective review of our implementation of the Brazil's National Adaptation Plan, with its permanent forum, with representatives of different sectors, with different Brazilian states, civil society, ensuring climate justice is part of its NDC, is a central element of its implementation strategy. So for now, I think that's it. We come back later. Thanks.
Thank you, Luisa. And I want to go to Oliver. As far as I know, Australia submitted a little bit more ambitious NDC. And how ambitious is it, and does it meet the demands of the civil society?
Thanks for that, and thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, that's correct. Australia is hopefully a little bit of a reflection of Brazil in the future. We had a very poor NDC. Our previous NDC was 26 to 28% reduction on 2005 levels, and that was going to include Kyoto carryover credits as part of the achievement of the NDC. That number was substantially less than what we're a federal state, what the states themselves were going to sort of build to regardless of federal government action. So it effectively represented no action at the federal level. In May, we had an election, and a new NDC was essentially taken to that election as part of the campaign by the Labor Party. And they have come, they won. And the new NDC is 43% below 2005 by 2030, and a net zero target of for 2050. It won't use any carryover credits, and that was something that was actually won by civil society in Australia prior to the election from the other party, but it's been confirmed in our current NDC. And then they've also put in place a new system by which the government is going to be held accountable for its emissions targets. So there is now going to be an annual statement to Parliament that has to be delivered by the Climate Minister on how they're achieving the NDC, and along with that statement to Parliament, they are now required to take advice from our Climate Change Authority. There's some issues with that. The Climate Change Authority is not a truly independent body. A lot of it is politically appointed, but at the same time, there is an administrative requirement to take into account some level of scientific understanding. The other piece that is fairly significant with this NDC is that the government has been very clear that it's a floor and not a ceiling, and that's something that civil society pushed very hard for. In terms of what civil society demanded, this has been a bit of a tricky political point in Australia. The last 7 prime ministers effectively won or lost their seats based on climate policy. Climate change is a very poisonous and intense issue politically in Australia. Prior to the last election in May, as I said, the Labor Party, which is now in power, brought this more ambitious NDC to the voters, and so civil society had to kind of choose whether or not they would accept 43%, which is not difficult to achieve from an Australian context, or whether or not they were willing to push really hard to see that number raised. In the election previously, civil society decided to push, and the party that was putting forward the more ambitious number lost. And so on this one, there was a relatively collective decision by civil society to allow the 43% to be the number as long as it was seen as a floor and not a ceiling, that was something that we could work on going forward with the government. WWF Australia has done some research in terms of what a 1.5 degree pathway looks like for Australia, recognising that we're a developed country, common but differentiated responsibility. And what we'd really like to see is a 74% target by 2030 with net zero by 2035. That's what 1.5 means in an Australian emissions context. So you can see that there's still a vast gap between 43% and the 74% that's really needed by the science. But that said, Australia is now bidding for COP31. There's plenty of opportunity to pressure the government and to push and to work with the government to see that NDC is either raised or that the ambition is raised regardless of the formal NDC position, and that's again that floor not a ceiling language that they've used that we think is really worthwhile both domestically and internationally, pushing Australia to see if we can raise that ambition. I think that's me for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. And Tanya, I will give the mic back to you. So Turkey hasn't updated its NDC yet, and the civil society in Turkey has been demanding some points for the NDC update for some time now. And what is the situation with Turkey's NDC?
Thank you very much, Cansu. I just want to start with our NDC back in 2015. What you see on the screen is the INDC, which was submitted by Turkey in 2015. Remember, the INDCs were submitted at the time where the Paris Agreement was adopted, and then Turkey became a party to the Paris Agreement last year, when Turkey also resubmitted this NDC as its official one, but also promised that it is going to update its NDC within the year. So we expect it to come out in this COP, actually. So what you see in this graph is the Turkish NDC also versus the actual emissions. So the red line, the Turkish NDC what it included was a reduction, 21% reduction from business as usual emissions. So the red line is the business as usual emissions, which shows us a reference scenario from 2012 to 2030, where the emissions actually triple from 430 million tons to 1.2 gigatons, basically. And what the NDC says is that instead of this, with taking actions at sectoral level, mainly in the energy sector, Turkey will limit its emissions on 929 million tons, which is also, when we put it into figures, is actually not a reduction, but actually doubling of emissions, almost doubling of emissions in comparison to current levels. So the rating of the climate action tracker to the Turkish NDC was critically insufficient, and if all the countries enhanced similar NDCs, then we would be in a trajectory of 4 degrees of global warming. So it is clear that we need a very much higher level of ambition, and it is also quite possible, actually, because when you look at the actual emission figures, it just diverts from the assumptions when this NDC was given in the first place. So it diverts starting from the year of 2015. And remember, in 2015, 2018, we didn't have the pandemic. So in 2018, we see that it's clearly below both the reference scenario and the mitigation scenario. And here in 2020, it is again, the diversion is even bigger. We see it way below the mitigation scenario. So what was the sectoral promises within the 2015 NDCs? When we look at them, we see that commitments, especially within the power generation sector, which 10 gigawatts installed capacity of solar power and 16 gigawatts wind capacity, and also lowering transmission and distribution losses. So when we look at the current figures, we are actually almost there. Our solar capacity is 9 gigawatts and wind capacity is 11 gigawatts. So there is some way for the wind energy targets, but we're already quite close there by 2022. Still we have 8 years. So this clearly shows that we have a room for much bigger ambition, and we must definitely revisit the reference scenario. So what was the civil society, what was the demand of the civil society? WWF Turkey, coming with the other fellow NGOs who are working on climate action in Turkey, we form a coalition of 17 civil society organizations, and we work together what could Turkey's level of ambition can be. And what we see is that Turkey can a 35% absolute emission reduction in comparison to 2020 levels is totally feasible for Turkey. So in terms of how, I will get into the details when we get into further questions in the second round. Thank you.
Okay, it's working. So thank you, Tanyeli. And I want to start the second round with you, Olivier, if possible. So as far as I know, mining and fossil fuels are biggest emitters in Australia. So are there any new decisions on the updated NDC, and what is your expectations about these sectors?
Thanks for that. Yeah, look, mining and fossil fuels are actually the big elephant in the room with Australia's NDC. Australia's the first, is the world's largest exporter of coal We're the 5th largest exporter of gas, and as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, neither of those, both of those count as Scope 3 emissions. They are not included in any of our emissions accounting. We are capable of reaching 43% while still supplying the world with coal and gas that will create global warming. And so there's a real question there as to how does our NDC actually fit in with our role as a global citizen? And at this stage, the government is still actively approving licenses for coal and gas exploration and for coal and gas export. And those are things that civil society is very actively attempting to engage the government with and is hopefully going to be succeeding. The activism within Australia is becoming more radical, and I think the government is starting to see the writing on the wall, but it's going to require further pushing. In terms of those sectors in and of themselves within the Australian context specifically, we are seeing a much higher mix of renewable energy being poured into our energy sector. There's quite a lot of money going through for transmission lines, which will allow for a more decentralised power base. And WWF Australia has a campaign called Renewables Nation, in which we're trying to see Australia produce 700% renewables, and that's 700% renewable energy, 700% renewable goods. We're working quite closely with carbon-intensive industries to see how they can transform their industries into a renewable-based industry and how they can use those industries to export renewable energy and renewable goods to the world. And that's how we see the pathway forward, that Australia can become a superpower in terms of renewables. And that's what we'd like to see the Australian government, the ambition of the Australian government going forward, and that's how we'd like to see our NDC achieved. Is an NDC for Australia, and also to accept that the Scope 3 is a problem and something that we can transform into an opportunity.
Thank you, Oliver. And Tanyeli, I want to come back to you. For Turkey, it's the energy emissions. The most emitting sector is the energy sector, and it's responsible of the 1/3 of the country's emissions. So what is the situation with energy emissions in Turkey?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. So before coming there, I also would like to come back to the NDC demands. A couple of points that I forgot to make in the first round. So when Turkey was adopting Paris Agreement, Turkey also committed for a net zero target for 2053. So it is quite essential for Turkey to start a downward trend in its emissions as soon as possible. So that is why an absolute emission reduction target is critical for Turkey, because if you do not start, then it's going to be harder and harder, it's going to be more and more expensive, and it's going to be more and more costly, not only economically but also socially. So in terms of how to do that, as Cansu has pointed out, the energy generation sector is the main emitter in Turkey, and also when we look at the sector more closely, we see that in our energy mix, 31% of our electricity comes from coal, and another 33% comes from gas, and 17% comes from hydro, and another 17% comes from wind, solar, and geothermal energy. So in this context, the first and most essential step is basically coal phase out by 2030. And our studies indicated that this is feasible within market conditions, because Turkey is about to adopt an emissions trading scheme where the carbon prices are going to be priced. This is mainly because of the CBAM of the European Union, because Turkey is a major exporter to the European Union. So in this case, whether we like it or not, we have to adopt an emissions trading scheme. Otherwise, the money will, instead of staying in Turkey, will go to Europe. Nobody would want that. So in this case, when we made a scenario where the carbon is priced in the energy sector, by the way, we were actually quite conservative. We did not take into account the current level of carbon price within the Europe Emissions Trading Scheme, which is about 90 euros per ton. Instead, we made an assumption of $48 per ton. So in that case, the coal becomes immediately infeasible, and then it is phased out in the system by 2030. But of course, in this case, we have to invest heavily on renewable sources, especially wind and solar, where the capacity increase should be about 6-7 gigawatts per year. Right now, it's about 2 gigawatts, and to have a more ambitious increase in capacities, we definitely need more allocation, faster allocation, and larger allocation, and also to for the investors, and also right now, if you want to invest in wind or solar in Turkey, you cannot just simply pick a side and say that, you know, build your windmills. No, that doesn't go that way. You have to get a capacity allocation from the grid. So in this case, you have to bid in the system. So instead of that, instead of bidding mechanisms which only opens like twice times per year, instead of that, the investors should be able to sell to the system directly, which would trigger more investments. So when we look at the other actions, we also see that when we have a sort of capacity, such a capacity increase, in this case, by 2030, we would have the share of renewables in the total energy mix of 75%, which would be way much higher to the current levels. So yeah, those are my notes for the energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanyeli. And Luisa, I want to come back to you. So we know deforestation is a major issue in Brazil, and also LULUCF sector is an emitter rather than being a sink in Brazil. So what is the situation with deforestation, and LULUCF sector in Brazil?
Thanks. Yes, indeed, deforestation in Brazil, it's our major emissions coming from them. There are some data released this week from SEG, which is the Gas Emissions Estimation System. Is an initiative from Climate Observatory, and has shown that in 2021, the Amazon deforestation was responsible for, was the biggest source of carbon emissions, and 49% of our emissions were associated with land use change and forests, so basically deforestation. And in 2020, it represented 46%, so we had an increase of 3% from one year to the other. Second, it's agriculture and cattle, which represents about 25% of our emissions, also the highest level since the beginning of the historical series, so we're talking about since 1990. So I don't know how much you know, but like the deforestation in Brazil during Bolsonaro's government increased severely. And so we are returning to levels that was surpassed like back in 2008. So not only our NDCs didn't got more ambitious, but also we don't have any policies in place to achieve that emissions, because we have at this moment all the really dismantling of our policies and agencies that protect the forest in Brazil, which is the biggest emitter. So we need to revert all of that immediately. And I would also add that we need to not set back any each before the end of this year. There are a lot of threats still going on in the National Congress that could be approved and would represent as well setbacks for the Brazilian legislation. So we need to reverse that all immediately. And on the forest sector, especially talking about the NDC, we need to make it more ambitious as well. As I said in the first round, We have today a target of ending illegal deforestation by 2028, and it is unacceptable, and I will give you a few reasons for that. Because there's a lot of talking about how ending illegal deforestation would resolve much of our problems, but indeed it wouldn't, and we have ways to achieve a zero deforestation. So first of all, we cannot have a target that is simply met by law enforcement, and that assumes that we can keep on going with criminal activities for over and over and over. And then also because that's something that's always happening in Brazil, like always this pressure coming that if it's too hard to achieve a target of stopping illegal deforestation, what they can do, they can simply change what is today considered illegal and become to become legal deforestation. So then it could meet our targets, but deforestation is still happening on the ground. Third, it's more than proved that we don't need to deforest any more square meter of land of any ecosystem in Brazil to increase our agricultural or cattle production. So there is no point to not look after a zero deforestation target. And fourth, and maybe more important, it's because simply scientists are constantly alerting us that Amazon might reach its turning point in a few years from now if nothing is done. So we really don't have more time, more trees to lose. We need to stop it right now.
Thanks a lot, Luisa. And I want to remember here last year's COP26 activists from Brazil who brought the deforestation issue to us again with their protests at COP26. They were so brave and important. So I want to give the floor to Tanyel again. And was or is the NDC preparation process in Turkey participatory?
Well, to put it shortly, I could say that we've got a quite a large room of improvement there. I can talk about the process of NDC development this year. The way the NDC is discussed within the Climate Change Coordination Board, which includes the policymakers, i.e. the relevant ministries, and also the business organizations, which actually sort of points out to a kind of participation deficit, because if the idea is only to include the executive bodies, then the private sector organization should not be there. But if the decision-making body is formed in a way, in a participatory way, if that is the intention, then civil society should be there, because there clearly is a deficit of participation, because the private sector only represents the private sector. So that's it. So in this year, the projections on NDCs was carried out within a project funded by the UNDP Turkey. So the stakeholders were invited, also including civil society, to a launch meeting. We were there and we were informed how the project was going to evolve, what sort of assumptions is the study going to be based on, etc., the methodology. And then, a year later, for the whole year, we could not be a part of the discussions. So currently, Turkey is also in a process of development of a climate law, which we see a very, very important aspect within the climate policy making in Turkey. So in this context, what we have proposed was that the drafting process of NDC uh, should be should include three separate bodies: an advisory board, including the civil society and the academia, which would give a scientific perspective. On the other hand, the policymakers, i.e., the executive institutions, and also the parliaments. So the policymakers and the advisory body should develop the NDC together, and then it should be adopted in the parliament. Later on, there should be a monitoring process. As you know, announcing the NDC is just the beginning of the way. So we should keep a close eye on where are we within our goals. So in this context, the monitoring, we should have a monitoring committee, including again civil society and academia, looking closely at what was our goal, where are we, how are we going, and also the board should come up with regular reports, including suggestions on what sort of additional actions are needed. And then those actions should be discussed in the parliament, and then the necessary actions should be taken accordingly. So those were that was the picture in terms of inclusiveness and our demands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanyeli. And Luisa, I want to come to you with the same question. How was the participation situation for the NDC development in Brazil?
Okay, so in 2000 and during the first NDC, there were some public consultations and so on. Not at all as we would hope it would be, but there were a few. During Bolsonaro's government, during the past two revisions, there were non-participation, non-transparency in the whole process. So I think at this moment we need really to demand that this revision of the NDC actually includes people, and not only includes people, but includes the concept of like climate justice itself as a central topic in the elaboration or in the revision of the NDC, but also in its implementation. So we need to have clear goals to reduce the climate vulnerability of women, riverside communities, indigenous people, quilombolas, LGBTQIA+ community, elderly, children, people with disability, and we have to have more investments in mitigation, adaptation, loss and damages. We need to have all them covered. We need to include these people in the political decision-making process and make sure that their voices are being heard for those that are actually elaborating and implementing this NDC. So also ensuring, of course, free, prior, informed consultation anytime any traditional community or traditional community may have impacts from a new legislation or from some measure foreseen that could affect their way of lives. This is really the minimum, and it should be addressed right now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Luisa. And Oliver, I want to ask the same to you. How was it in Australia?
Yeah, thanks. I think it kind of depends a little bit on who you ask and how you define participatory. I think if you ask our government, was it participatory? They'll say resoundingly yes, it was taken to an election. 25 million Australians voted on this as a climate target. You can't get more participatory than that. But where did the number come from? No one's really sure. It was the number was reduced from the same party's previous election bid, and they reduced their ambition on that front. The new climate legislation, as I mentioned before, has a requirement for the climate change minister when revising this NDC to consult with the Climate Change Authority. Again, that is a semi-independent government body. It is the head of the Climate Change Authority is appointed by the government of the day, but they are required to provide input into the development of a new NDC. The minister is not required to take that input into account when developing the NDC, but they are required to have the input. They can also request input from any other body, and to an extent that sounds great. That means civil society could have a role to play in pushing for a higher number, developing processes by which we can have a roadmap and a pathway to more ambition, but it also means that the fossil fuel lobby can have that participation. And so we need to sort of think, I think in Australia particularly, long and hard about what we mean by participation and what we think that the outcomes of that participation are going to be for the powers that are making the decisions on NDC development. I guess ultimately I'd kind of leave it though right back where I started, where multiple surveys in Australia have shown that the vast majority of Australians want to see strong and deep climate action. And so there is an idea that if a government continued to bring higher and higher ambition NDCs to elections, that those NDCs could be picked up. What we need to make sure is that conversation isn't consistently hijacked by the wealthy and quite powerful, but relatively small in number, fossil fuel lobby. And that's where we sit with NDCs and with participation at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. I will give the floor to our guests for questions, but before that I want to thank all three of you for your speaks and also for being just in time. I don't know how all you managed that, everybody spoke just the correct amount of time. And before giving you the floor, I want to shortly sum up. I think it's very important to emphasize on what Luisa said first. NDCs should include climate justice and they should try to protect vulnerable people. But we see these three G20 countries are not very hopeful about these our demands. And I see firstly Turkey and Brazil are using the methodology changes for creating more implementation gap. I think that is the first point that should be changed. And then there is a little bit more ambition from Australia, but there is also, of course, capabilities and capacities. And then it's also a little sad to hear, not a little, a lot sad to hear that Australia also doesn't have a fully independent climate change authority. And what I understand is none of these NDC development processes were fully transparent and fully open to participation and ideas of the civil society. I want to give the floor to our guests if there are any questions. Yes, please. I give you the mic.
Hi, I'm Fernanda Carvalho, head of policy at WWF for Climate and Energy. And first, I wanted to congratulate my colleagues. We started working with the NDCs We Want, a methodology to analyze NDCs a few years ago, and I think it empowered our offices to look at NDCs, so it's very rewarding to see this here. And my question to the three of you would be, since all NDCs need more ambition, and we also need more ambition globally, what can this COP, which signals could this COP send to your country that would make them, that could make them enhance their ambition?
Does this work? Oh, it works. That's amazing. No, it doesn't.
Is this on? Yeah, you can.
That one works. Okay, cool. I think with Australia having so recently updated our NDC, what this COP, the signal that this COP could send to the Australian government is that is rewarded. That seeing Australia come back and start to work towards becoming a climate leader is something that the global community sees as valuable and as an asset. We recently saw on Saturday, actually, the Australian government is bidding for COP31. And I think that were the Australian government to achieve, to be successful in that bid and to host a COP, that would provide the moment around which we can catalyse Australian ambition to increase its NDC and to become a sort of a global leader on climate change, which it has the potential to be. It's just been a laggard for a disturbingly long time. But we think we might be able to get there. So I think for us, that's probably the next big step, is the reward and then the feedback loop that can create.
Well, in our case, I think that not only for Turkey, but for all NDCs, There, I see two critical issues that are being discussed at COP20, COP27. One is mitigation work program. If we see there clear sectoral sectoral aspects, how the mitigation can be further enhanced, and what sort of a room we have there more, then that could send a clear signal to not only G20 countries but all countries that how can they further enhance these NDCs, which would be more clear. And the second aspect I see very, very critical is the global stocktake. The global stocktake process started last year, and this year we are on midway. And this year, this COP is very, very critical because this is when the context, the index of global stocktake process is going to take place. After this COP, then we are going to have a sort of idea what we are going to see next year. Global stocktake is the backbone of the Paris Agreement because that is the most important aspect of the Paris Agreement in terms of transparency, in terms of seeing where we are within our collective goal, what are the parties doing, how are they doing, is that enough or not? These are the questions that should be answered in very much detail by the global stocktake process. So in this context, more transparency also sends a clear signal to all parties in terms of not only the necessity of developing their NDCs, but also in terms of giving more room for inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I think in the case of Brazil, what made us have a less ambitious NDC at this point, it's a clear result of a policy direction that was in place in Brazil for the past years. So it's not by an accident that we are at this point with such high levels of deforestation and such poor NDC. So I think for us that it's in a curious moment because we have a new president elected, but it's only gets into his position in January 1st, but he's coming here. So, I mean, there's a lot of possible signs that Brazil could show to the world, like giving a new impression. I mean, for the past years, Brazil isolated completely from the international negotiations. We've lost investments and comparisons with international countries. We've lost a lot. So Lula, during his campaign, has made some commitments. He has made some commitments already in his victory speech, and he's coming here. We'll have to see what he has to say, of course, and keep pressuring him to put them in place, and pressure for more ambitions if it's needed. And the civil society in Brazil will keep working and will keep pushing for more ambitions, of course. But I think we have a good opportunity this moment to already show the world that there are political interests in reversing this this current policy that's in place, and look for a future, or for a few more for the next years, more connected with what we need globally. I mean, to reduce emissions urgently, to include climate justice, to include the people, to have finances mechanisms that achieve these people. I mean, I think we could have this opportunity this year, and that hopefully could help as well other countries to come on board as well. I mean, thanks.
Thank you, Luisa. I don't see any other, yeah.
Thank you very much. Tatiana Shaura from CAN Europe. I have a very short question about Turkey. You mentioned something very interesting about the coal and the coal phase out. That the first step and the step that means that makes sense the most is the coal phase out. But because you are exporting a lot of coal to Europe, and at the moment that is also a big source of income for Turkey, that is kind of complex. So would you say that the similarity between European Union locking African countries with the gas projects because they need to replace Russian gas and Russian energy sources doesn't have any similarity to what is happening to the export of energy sources from Turkey to European Union.
Well, I mean, what you're saying is have to say it's a conjunctural development which cannot go on in the long term. We are talking about a phase out by 2030. Yes, we have the energy crisis, and yes, the coal and gas prices jumped up, and right now the cost of coal in Turkey quite minimal. But I should also remind you the fact that the coal extracted in Turkey is lignite, and it's not really efficient. And I do not see really much of a potential in terms of much of a potential in terms of export of Turkish coal to other countries. I mean, when we look at we did several feasibility studies of coal power generation in Turkey, and we see that a new coal power plant in Turkey is totally feasible within the current prices. I mean, if a country, I mean, we have clear targets, clear mandates. We want to be net zero by mid-century, and we have to start cutting our emissions very fast. And I don't see coal in this picture.
Is open? Yes. And are there any other questions? Okay, seems like not. So it looks crystal clear from here that we, as the world, need way more ambitious NDCs and much better implementation. It is clear from here. I hope it gets clear for the decision makers as well. Thank you for coming here, and thanks to all our three speakers for sharing their points and the ideas from their countries. Hope to see you soon in another event.